We're going to be going over AOVs in Maya. AOV stands for arbitrary output value, and it is just a different name for a render pass. You'll sometimes hear it referred to as a render layer. There are some slight differences, but for now it can be interchangeable. Setting up AOVs is actually not too difficult, and it gives you a lot of editing ability after you render. Before, when we went up to Arnold and open Arnold render view, we would render and we would have what's called a beauty render, and that combines all of your lighting, your color, your specularity, your shadows into one image. When you have AOVs enabled, all of that will be separate images in your same render, and you're able to take this into Photoshop, composite together, and you have a great deal of ability to enhance your image. What it would look like when you're in Photoshop is this. You have one image that has multiple layers, and these are all automatically saved out from Arnold. And at the top we have a ZDepth pass, which is your depth of field. And things closer to the camera are black, things further away are white, and with a very simple filter in Photoshop, you're able to set your focus distance wherever you want. You also have an ID, and this is helpful if you want to just select one object from your scene. Even though some of the colors look very, very different, they are all slightly, or look a little bit the same, they're all slightly different. So you can very easily select just one object. And then you have a different pass for all of your different lighting information, as well as your ambient occlusion. You also have a pass for your transmission, which are things that are behind your glass or transparent objects. Then we have one pass that is just specularity, one pass that is just color, and it also saves out a beauty render as well. And when you change the layer blendings, you can get a really nice final image. Setting up AOVs is not too hard. You just need to know what you have in your scene. So right now I have my lights. I have 4 lights, an HDRI dome, a rim light, a fill light, and a key light. I don't have any opacity or glass in this version. And when you open up your Arnold render settings, you have this. It will automatically default to an EXR, which is fine. We're not actually going to be using too much in your file output. But when you are doing a final render, you do want to up your resolution a bit. And we'll go over more of this later. In the 4th tab, it says AOVs. And right now I have Ambient Occlusion, ID, RGBA, which is my lighting information, a ZDepth, diffuse, specular, and transmission. These are all, by default, none of these are assigned, and you have these arrows to move them from one side or the other. So I don't need transmission, so I'm going to move it to the side. And you can have a great deal of AOVs in Arnold, and you can create some custom ones as well. I'm just going to remove all of my AOVs. And to begin, we need to assign our lights to a specific layer. So I'm going to click on my light, and I believe it is in the Shape tab. Yep. So the 2nd tab, the one that ends in Shape, if you scroll down to Visibility, we have Camera, Transmission, Diffuse, all these different options, and at the bottom we have AOV Light Group. And all you have to do is put it in its own group. So this is my rim light, so I typed in rim. For my fill light, I have fill, my key light has key, and my HDR sky has an HDRI group. This will render out a separate image just for each light, and we can control how strong or how weak the light is on the overall image. Now just because you assign them to groups, that does not mean it will actually render out. We need to tell it to render out those layers. And there's nothing here that actually says light. But what you have to do is select this RGBA and hit the two arrows and turn it on over here. When you have it selected in your attribute editor, you have a lot of different options over here. Fortunately, all you have to do is select all light groups, and all of your lighting groups will now be rendered out as a separate layer. Next, I do want to have a ZDepth pass. I'm just going to click the arrows and drag it over. Moving down, I'm also going to have a diffuse. If you have emission, you'd need to have an emission pass, but I don't have anything that glows. Scrolling down, I do want my specular. If you have glass, you'll have your transmission. And everything else is okay as it is. However, I'm going to add ID as well. And we also want an ambient occlusion, and there isn't actually an ambient occlusion render. There are two ways we could do it. We could go up to the debug shading and just save out an ambient occlusion pass, but we're going to create a custom AOV. So I'm going to hit add custom. I'm just going to call it AO for ambient occlusion. And with it selected in the attribute editor, we have our custom AOV and a shader, so it's looking for a specific material. I'm going to click on the checkerboard, and opening this up, I'm going to search for Arnold, and we have AI Ambient Occlusion. If you can't find it, just type in AI Ambient, and it will show up. We now have our ambient occlusion. We're able to customize it a little bit, and we'll be able to see what these different settings do when we're actually rendering. Now that we have our AOVs set up, I'm going to go back to common. I rendered this out at 3840 by 2160. I got a really nice result. I'm going to turn this down just so it doesn't take quite as long, and I'm going to go down to HD 540. Then I'm going to go up to Arnold, open Arnold Render View. This won't look any different than what we've done before. And you'll notice if we click on Beauty, we don't actually have any of our AOVs listed. And that's because they won't show up until you actually start rendering. By default, it will render my perspective camera, which I do not want. I have a render camera that is set up with a specific field of view that I want. When I hit start for my render, it'll take a moment, and you can see it is rendering the wrong camera. Now that it's starting, I can change between all my renderable cameras. So I'm going to go to Render Cam, and now this is the correct view. And under Beauty, you can see that we have all of our different layers. I'm going to pause the video and come back when it is done rendering. Now that it's done rendering, I'm going to hit this little button on the bottom just to save it, just in case I accidentally move something. And I'm going to cycle through the different AOVs. So it starts with the beauty at the top, then we have the rim light, and this is everything the rim light is doing. And then we have the HDR dome, which is much more uniform, and we have some nice reflections in the chessboard and the pieces. The fill light, the key light, which is very dim. I'm probably going to have to turn that up in Photoshop a little bit or just not use it. You do have this slider up here for exposure, which can be very, very helpful. Its default is 0. It does carry over to different layers, so when I'm done looking at it, I just reset it to 0. We have the ambient occlusion, the ID, the ZDepth, which you need to save out separately, but you can see that there is information here. But again, the exposure is a little bit off, and we'll have to do a little bit of photoshopping to get this back. And then we have the diffuse, and finally the specularity. You don't have to save these out individually. You can come up to File, Save Image, and it's going to make a new folder. And if you were saving them out one at a time, I would call this one specular.exr. If you need to change the file format when you are saving, it'll default to a JPEG. We do not want a JPEG for what we are doing, so we can just type the file format that we want and then hit save. Or what you can do is just go back up to your default beauty, file, save, multi-layer EXR. It'll look like the exact same file save window, but it will default to an EXR image. And then name it and hit save. And when you open it in Photoshop, you will have some other options, which I will go over in a moment. By default, Photoshop can read EXR files. However, if you just drag and drop it into Photoshop, it will open up and you will just get your beauty layer, which is not what you want. You will not have access to any of your render layers, which defeats the whole purpose of doing this. It would be no different than if you just did a JPEG save. What you need to do is go to exr-io.com and you can download a free plugin for Photoshop that will read a multi-layer EXR file and give you full access to what that file contains. You can download it and then automatically install it, and when you open an EXR image, it will open the plugin. And it will look like this. You go File, Open. You will get this little pop-up. All the defaults are okay, and just hit Open. And now, instead of just having one layer, you have multiple layers from your EXR. Yours might be in a slightly different order. That is okay. We can very easily drag and drop these around. Going to turn off all of them and put my diffuse on the bottom and turn on and just have my diffuse. And all we're going to be doing are changing the layer blending and maybe adding a few adjustment layers. And specularity will be second. I'm going to turn on my specularity. And as you can see, it's not actually blending, it is just on top of my diffuse. I'm going to come up to my normal blending mode, which means there is no blending. And I'll try to go down to screen. However, if you notice, screen is grayed out, as is a lot of our other layer blending. And this is because this is a 32-bit image. 32-bit images are absolutely huge, and Photoshop doesn't always like them. The difference between 16 and 32-bit image is quite large. A 16-bit image has 65,000 tonal values, and a 32-bit image has over 4 trillion tonal values. We need to reduce it down to something that we can actually use. We don't need the full 32-bit. That is just the default that EXR files go to. So in the image menu on the top, I'm going to go to Mode and go down to 16 bits per channel. You do not want to merge everything. If you merge, you will lose all of your layers and you will not have access to them anymore. So don't merge. It won't look any different. But now when I select my specular, I can come up to normal and go to screen. And you can see that now I have my color as well as my specularity in the same image. I'm going to drag my ZDepth up to the top and my ID as well. And next I'm going to go to my rim light. And for my rim light, generally I'll go to screen or linear dodge. There's not one correct answer for which layer blending you should use. Oftentimes I'll cycle through them and figure out which one I think looks the best. And depending on what you're going for, something else might work better. But for now I'm going to go to linear dodge, and it's a little bit too bright for me. I don't want it to be that overexposed. So I'm going to open up my adjustments layer or window up here. If you don't have it, come up to Windows and Adjustments. And I'm going to make a levels adjustment. It is important that you make your adjustments through this window, not under Image, Adjustments, and Levels. This will be destructive editing, meaning you won't have a layer here and it will be hard-coded into your image. You won't have the ability to go back and change it. When you make it here, it will affect everything, but you'll be able to go back and change it whenever you want. Get my properties over here as well. And right now, as I said, this layer affects the entire image, which I really don't want, so we'll fix that in a moment. So I just want it to affect this RGBA rim, so if you right click on it, you can go down to Create Clipping Mask, and now it's only going to affect the layer directly below it. So it is just going to be affecting the rim light. So I'm just going to turn it down so I can still see those checkers. Now moving up, I'm going to turn on my key light. This is the one that is super dim. I will create another levels node. Right click, go to Create Clipping Mask. And just turn it up a little bit. This window right here is the histogram, and you can see I have not a lot of information here. So if I wanted, I could go back to Maya and turn this light up a little bit, but for now I'm just going to see what I can salvage from it here. And I'm probably just going to turn it off. It's not enough information, lighting information for me to want to keep it. So I'm just going to hit the little trash icon and get rid of the adjustment layer and that actual layer itself. The HDRI sphere does have a lot more information. I can come over to Screen or Linear Dodge, Add, figure out which one I like more. I'll go for this one. And again, if it's too bright, Levels, and Create Clipping Mask. You don't always have to do a level, you can use whichever one you want. And maybe a brightness and contrast as well with another clipping mask. And then same thing for my fill light. I'm actually okay with that one as it is. My ambient occlusion is the same as ambient occlusion before. I can come up to normal and come down to multiply. And that adds a nice little bit of self-shadowing. This top one, this is a default lighting one that kind of has all the lighting information in it and in one layer. I'm just going to throw that one away. My ID isn't really necessary for the image, but it is really nice if I want to edit a specific piece. I can select this layer, hit W to open up my magic wand tool, or you can come over here, 4 tools down, right click, make sure it says magic wand. And I'm going to set my tolerance down to 1. I do not want it to pick really similar colors, I just want it to pick that one color. And I can click on, say, the queen, and then just have a very clean selection of the queen. And then we have the ZDepth pass, which I said we'll have to come back to. It does not save out of Arnold correctly in a multi-layer EXR, and since we converted to 32-bit, it lost some of that information, so I'm going to throw it away and go back to Maya. I'm going to change to just view my ZDepth, which we can see there is information here. And I'm going to go to File, Save Image, put it in the correct folder, and just call it ZDepth. Hit save. And then back in Photoshop, I will open it up. I did not specify it to save as an EXR. So save image. ZDepth.exr, it will automatically save as a JPEG, which I do not want. And now I'll have an EXR file for my ZDepth. And with this plugin, just hit open. And we have to do a little bit of photoshopping to recover this data. There are a few different ways you could go about getting information back. Before I convert to 16-bit, I'm going to create a levels layer, or adjustment layer. And on this bottom slider, I'm going to bring the white values almost all the way down. It doesn't need to be perfect right now, we can always change it later, but I do want to see this. Now I'm going to come up to Image, Mode, and 16-bit, and I am going to merge this together. It will change in values a little bit, it'll be much darker overall, so I'm going to create another adjustment layer. It will also bring up your HDR toning when you merge, just hit OK. I'm going to make another adjustment layer for my levels and just play with some of the blacks and whites. You can see here I don't have any values over here on the left for black, so I'm going to move my slider over so my black starts right here. Before, the darkest value in my scene was this light gray. I'm now telling Photoshop that that is black. And I do want to have a nice kind of gradient between them. This would look better if it was a higher resolution render, but this will get the job done. I'm going to select my adjustment layer and hit Alt, Control, Shift, and E. That will make a copy of those two things and merge it together in one layer. If you're on a Mac, it would be Command Option Shift E. And I'm going to copy this layer, just Control C, come over to my main image and hit Control V, and it will paste right on top. And now I actually need to do something with my ZDepth because it doesn't look great right now. I'm going to open up my channel box. And if you don't have it, you can come up to Window and Channel. And it does have an alpha, but it's not great by default, so I'm going to select it and just hit delete. And then we have a red, green, and blue channel. And if you hold down Control and select any one of the RG or B layers, we will get a selection. And I want to turn this into my alpha. So in my channels box, I have this little create selection as a channel, and I'll have alpha 1. I'm going to rename this as my ZDepth. Then I can hit Control D to deselect and just turn off my my ZDepth pass. If you have some weird red to values, just click your RGB and hopefully it will go away. Then turn off your ZDepth pass, and that one should be good to go. I'm going to rename this ZDepth for my layer, and we're going to use a filter. This is where our editing becomes a little bit more destructive, so I'm going to put all of this that I edited into a group, select my top layer, which should be Ambient Occlusion, and hit Alt or Option, Control or Command, Shift and E, and that will create a new layer. So if I turn off this, I'll have the exact same information right here. Now I'll come up to Filter, Blur, and Lens Blur. And when I bring the window over, there we go, we can see it is blurring the image a lot. And is not doing anything useful for depth of field. It is a uniform blur. But it does ask for a depth map, and the source is none. So if I click on none, I named my alpha ZDepth, so I'm going to go to ZDepth. And you can see that now we have something that looks a little bit better. The set focal point should be turned on by default. If it's not, just click on it so it has a little gray box around it, and wherever you click will be in focus. So I'm going to focus my scene on this pond. I think it looks good. You have a radius to turn up or down your blur. And a few other options that you can change if you would like. And when you're done, hit OK. And it is destructive, so the only way you can undo that is Control Z, which is why I made this a new layer. I'm going to bring the other version of this over and quickly set up my layer bundling. So here I have a much higher resolution of the same thing. The only difference is I do have a wine glass in here, which I don't really like how it turned out, which is why I turned it off for the other one. But it's the same render, just at 4K. And I'm going to set up my ZDepth pass again. So in my channels, bring this over. I'm going to delete the alpha that it came with. Control click on blue, red or green, it doesn't really matter. Create a mask from it. Deselect, and just turn off that layer. I already have a copy of my layer stack. For the transmission, all I did was set it to screen, and it turned out pretty well. Come back to my layer, come up to Filter, Blur, and Lens Blur. Make sure it is using Alpha 1, which I did not rename, but that is okay. Turn the radius up a bit, and focus in on that pond. Then hit OK, and have a little bit of depth of field on my image. Using render layers is a really good way of getting a high quality portfolio piece out of Arnold. Using the default renderer is okay, but you do not have anywhere near the control as if you used your render layers.